Hi, so it's a 6:15 now, so let's start our last event in our lecture series, Whose Knowledge? We are very, very happy to have Imani K. Johnson here, joining us from the US, from California. It's very early in the morning for her, so we are very happy that she made it possible. Let me just give you a few things, or let me say something about this digital meeting, because it's the first one we have in this lecture series. Everything else has been in presence. So, I mean, the order is more or less the same. So I will now briefly introduce Imani K. Johnson. Then we will have her talk. And after that, there will be time for questions from you. Now let me introduce Imani K. Johnson, which is a great, great pleasure for me. So she is an interdisciplinary scholar who specializes in the African diaspora, in global popular culture and hip hop. And she's an associate professor in the Department of Black Study and vice chair of the Department of Dance at UC Riverside in California. She received her BA from UC Berkeley, her MA from New York University, and has a PhD from the University of Southern California. And we actually met, we just talked about it 10 years ago at a summer school on decolonizing knowledge and power in Barcelona. So yeah, I'm very happy that we meet again under these circumstances, and that she can also share her research and her great work with you. And I also think it's really good that we have somebody from dance studies, especially from hip hop studies, joining us, because in this whole lecture series, we have been talking about whose knowledges are transmitted in which ways, and how marginalized knowledges can foster, through art, for example, collective empowerment. And I think we're going to hear very interesting things about this today. And Imani K. Johnson also, at least when I was reading her bio note, I had the feeling you really embody also this idea of collective empowerment and the politicization of knowledge, to think about, okay, what can knowledge do, especially also academic knowledge, because she has founded and is central in the organization of the Show and Prove Hip Hop Studies Conference series, which fosters hip hop studies as a field that is also responsible to communities beyond the academy. And she has also co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Hip Hop Dance Studies, which is the first collection of that kind of peer-reviewed research on hip hop street dances, which brings together practitioners, scholars, and scholar practitioners, scholars, however you want to order it. And the book she's going to talk about today, which I have here, which I'm currently reading and I really, really like, is called Dark Matter and Breaking Ciphers, The Life of Africanist Aesthetics in Global Hip Hop. So it's about the ritual dance circle in international hip hop dance communities, which I think we're going to hear a lot about today as well. And that was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. And in this book, she examines the political, cultural, and spiritual nature of hip hop dance by examining the practice of ciphering. So these are these collaborative and competitive dance circles. And with this, she also examines the histories of exclusion, marginalization, and invisibilization that shape the aesthetics of this practice. And there's also a really nice, just a quick phrase I found in your introduction that I want just to share, where you say, my research deals with living cultural resources, often invisibilized by the global reach of anti-Blackness, revealing otherwise unrecognized layers of meaning within ciphers. So with this, and I hope we hear about this today as well, I give the word to you, and I'm very excited to hear about your work and about breaking ciphers. So the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my work with y'all. So yes, my name is Imani Kai Johnson, and I've been doing this work for a minute, so a while. It's a colloquial way of saying almost 20 years. So today I'm sharing excerpts from Dark Matter and Breaking Ciphers. I'm going to share my screen. So there's a lovely visual aid to pay attention to as I do so. So I'm sharing excerpts from the book today and attempting to think through a strain that runs through it that are about modes of sociality and the embodied knowledges in them. And within the context of breaking ciphers. And I describe it in my talk as an expansive sociality. That's not the term I necessarily use in the book. I also refer to as a funk sociality. I'll talk about that in a bit. And thinking about specifically a relationship to the other or otherness, both in oneself and in the cipher and metaphorically as global hip hop. So that's kind of the focus for today's talk. And the excerpts I'm sharing are actually elements from across the book. So my hope is to activate a sentiment embedded in the structure, a kind of circularity in the discussion, wherein examples from one chapter overlap with arguments in another. And by enacting that circle with the writing and writing about the dance circle, I hope to kind of create space to talk about expansive sociality that the practice fosters by way of its Black aesthetics. So that is to say, through a process of dancing the song together, breakers embody philosophies of collective enactments across differences, offering insight into ideas of coalition building central to progressive political movements. And as Joanna mentioned, these are my books, co-edited with Mary Fogarty, Dr. Mary Fogarty at York University, the Oxford Handbook of Hip Hop Dance Studies, so the first of its kind. And my actual book, my first, Dark Matter and Breaking Ciphers. And so today's talk is pulling from the book. All right, so if you are unfamiliar with what ciphers are, and you're probably more familiar than you realize, it's the dance circle. And this is an example of a dance circle footage that I shot in 2009. And so I want to start by sharing some keywords that I think will kind of get us on the same page. So practitioners generally of this particular genre of dance, of hip hop dance, and there are many different types of hip hop dances. This particular genre is called breaking. And its practitioners typically identify as B-boys or B-girls. So that is to say, in discourse, hip hop's most authenticating terms for breakers are B-boy and B-girl, which seems to reify gender bifurcation at the culture's linguistic foundations. In this binary, the B-boy is typically, or B-boy, the term is already kind of dominant and gets positioned as cultural representative. And as a result, B-girls are all too easily read as simply performing some version of masculinity, justifying assumptions that combat dances like rocking and breaking are decidedly not feminine. And though framed in that way, when breaking, B-girls upend these assumptions whenever they hit the floor. And so that language distinction, I think, belies an underlying possibility in understanding people's relationship to each other by way of this dance. And the clip that we're looking at is a version of a cipher. And this isn't really a battle cipher, it's just a cipher. It's people dancing together. It's a social dance circle. So ciphering is a multi-sensorial collective experience cloaked as an individual one. Ciphers are communal rituals fueled by a distinct understanding of competition and operating within an oral kinesthetic setting wherein dancers take turns in the center while building on and responding to the offerings of preceding dancers. And that call and response exchange among practitioners and with the DJ cultivates an energy or a vibe distinct to that cipher. So looking at this sample video, things to realize. One, while it can be visually enticing, you kind of have to avoid an ocular-centric approach, which is to say, seeing is only one analytic lens, and it's not necessarily the most important one. The exchange between dancers matters. You notice at the very end of that last little moment, somebody entered the circle before somebody left. So there was like a moment where there was a little bit of attention precisely because that person who felt like their time in the circle was incurred upon stayed longer, doing nothing in particular, just to disrupt somebody else's efforts, right? Because they felt it was maybe disrespectful. Embodiment really matters, which is to say, and this is what we pay attention to in dance studies, that there's really a lot of information embedded in the practice, in the doing of the thing. And then there are elements we also don't see, what I refer to as Africanist aesthetics, what scholars refer to as Africanist aesthetics, which is say we recognize but often leave unnamed, particularly in American pop culture, those elements of African diasporic sensibilities that are informing the nature of the exchange. So Africanist aesthetics, by that I refer to living expressive cultural resources in African and African diasporic practices, and evident in everything from sports to spiritual expression, literature, dance, and everyday life. They are mutually activating, and in their interactions relay layers of knowledge and reflect a social philosophy embedded in practice. Living cultural resources tied to varied forms of Black life. These aesthetics shape how the body is held, how people interact, the soundscape, performance approaches, and on. And so I developed this list, this table really of elements that are particularly relevant to breaking ciphers specifically. And I draw on scholarly studies of dance, oral and literary traditions, theater, sports, spiritual expressions, music and dance forms, everyday expressive practices, and more. Sometimes their assessments are specific to a US African-American context, and others speak to specific sites within the African diaspora, and still others are thinking through and across the diaspora on the continent of Africa. I've compiled those especially relevant to breaking ciphers, and it's roughly organized around dance elements, spirit, and conversational elements. So, and this is strictly for the sake of clarity, with explicit caution against treating it as a static list that is somehow exhaustive of all dimensions of Africanist aesthetics. It is not. And if it's treated as a checklist, one misses the point. So the dance elements give us some specificity around bodies and relationships with other bodies and experiences within the body. Spiritual elements draw attention to what I sometimes refer to as the kind of extra phenomenal elements of ciphering, the sense of freedom, spiritual connection, being in the zone, communion with God or community, feelings of liberation, and conversational elements, which are those elements that are specifically kind of drawing out the exchange with others, call and response, ritual derision, so insult games, mockery, the back and forth, things like that are elements that necessarily put you in relationship to and in dynamic exchange with someone else. And these are very informative of what we see happening in ciphers. And things that we can't see, right? The underlying things that we can't see. You can't see when somebody is necessarily feeling a kind of communion with an ancestor, for example, but you can maybe understand or feel, experience a shift in how they're dancing because they're in the zone. So while many of these qualities are likely evident in other cultural paradigms, Africanist aesthetics are discernible by the layered and mutually activating quality of each element. For example, oral kinesthetics is an Africanist aesthetic whose meaningfulness gets activated when it is part of a call and response exchange with the DJ and among dancers, where people are expected and encouraged to move improvisationally and originally, where polyrhythmic music is met with a bent knee stance that allows for polycentric movement. And when organized within a ritual circle, each quality activates a constellation of others that work together. The epistemological possibilities of Africanist aesthetics becomes evident in their mutual interaction. Within all of it are layers of meaning not meant for everyone to understand or interpret equally. Those more exposed to the subterranean meaning of those practices know the body speaks multiple tongues, and dance scholar Brenda Dixon Gottschild reaffirms these connections, noting that they are, quote, intratextual, so to speak, and do not appear as separate entities in practice, unquote. Gottschild also reminds us that though always already active in new and syncretic forms, Africanist aesthetics are invisibilized as a function of power and anti-Black ideologies that erase histories of African Americans and the African peoples in the Americas. Recognizing Africanist aesthetics in action and centering the layers of information they carry is to combat their invisibility. And so today I'm going to go through three actually, Africanist aesthetic qualities And we're going to hear from two B-girls in particular whose commentary provides critical insight into how these aesthetics live in global breaking culture. And so the first I want to explore as an example is originality, and thinking about originality particularly as what I refer to in relation. So thinking about originality, ciphering's lessons in striving toward a breaker's own original style by innovating distinct approaches, styles, or moves is also a practice of sociality in the circle. What I couch under originality heavily overlaps with what dance scholar Thomas DeFrance refers to as, quote, African-American expressive imperative to innovate. In his article, Hip Hop Habitus, Volume 2.0, DeFrance describes this imperative as part of, quote, an unprecedented alignment of desire, intention, and action, unquote, that prizes the work of the individual innovation within a group dynamic. To God's shield, the dancers leap into improvisation and innovation happens when the collective circle operates as a safety net. Okay. We can just look at the footage again while I'm doing that. So improvisation and innovation happen within the collective circle when the collective circle operates as a safety net. So in her article, Crossroads, Continuity or Contradiction, the Afro-European Caribbean Triangle, Gottschalk focuses on Caribbean dance's Africanist aesthetic standards, placing originality under two headings, improvisation and collective communal trust. B-girls can let it all hang out because communal trust and respect for tradition balance improvisation and the force of the unforeseen. For DeFrance, the unforeseen in Black aesthetics is a through line between multiple capacities: the capacity to dance beyond what seems possible, but the potentially unlimited capacity to innovate and express oneself, and the ways that such capacities defy the boundaries laid out for Black people. He writes, quote, hip-hop dances surely arise from this tradition of dance that defies expectation, dances that confirm somehow beyond reach, freedom, question marks, and he puts that in parentheses, but present within the capacity of the physicality of doing. And that is a sentence in the book and in a couple of chapters that I come back to a lot, that these are dances that confirm something beyond reach, possibly freedom, but something that is nonetheless present within the capacity of the physicality of doing. And in that formulation, the collective is key. The differences and experiences along gender lines does not supplant their shared experiences as practitioners. Fogarty states that, quote, there is a careful thoughtfulness to B-girls' articulations of their experience as women, especially when asked to address gender explicitly. At the same time, women are constantly asked about their gender simply because they break and are resistant to setting themselves apart from B-boys who share their experiences and journeys. She names resistance outright, drawing attention to B-girls' careful framing that insists one listen deeply and challenges researchers like me to understand beyond our own ideological premises. I experienced such a discursive pivot, one that delicately corrects as it models in a 2006 interview with B-girl Rockefeller. After I asked her if there were any support networks, quote, available for B-girls, Rockefeller responded, quote, I think we're creating them. I don't think they're there yet. It's not as if there are any real support networks for B-boys either, unquote. It may seem a minor shift of little consequence, but her attendance to Breaker's shared needs, even after a pointed question about B-girls, is an example of this subtle resistance that repeated itself in our interview and in interviews with other B-girls. With that said, differences in experiences along gender lines do create culturally internal frictions. Mastery of the dance or culture are also a way to then level that playing field. And I have to apologize for with my interview with Rockefeller, it was literally like an interview on a landline that I recorded on a cassette tape. So the digital audio recording of this is horrible. So I have to read her quotes, which is unfortunate because I would much rather you hear her voice. I'll continue. So mastery of the dance or culture are a way to level the playing field. For example, in our interview, whenever Rockefeller discussed sexism, she talked she dealt with as an Afro-Puerto Rican woman in different kinds of dance spaces, and she specified the streets, the clubs, party circuit, theater, and dance institutional spaces. She repeatedly returned to the significance of building up an expertise that comes from a deep knowledge of the dance and its culture. So she says, for example, I knew that I had to train, I wasn't trying to be treated like, like a weaker gender or a stupid person or a groupie. And a few minutes later, she says, so to come in and see breakers try to, present this to me again, like, look, there's a hierarchy and you're at the bottom. And then she scoffed and she says, I wasn't having it because I already had my rep. And then she says a few minutes later, I knew that part of making them see that I was equal was learning the dance and training and learning the history. So, I had to go and get into the lab once again and get what I needed. Mastery of breaking is its own form of armor, equipping her to battle sexism through practice, and developing mastery earns respect and can influence relationships and change minds. I propose that breakers dance a competing formulation of relation that foregrounds practice, and that is only sometimes verbalized precisely because it is danced. Such a formulation does not rely on a colonial gender binary as its organizing logic, and those careful articulations consequently counterbalance an overdetermined binary discourse. Moreover, B-girls are more likely to verbalize it because they get repeatedly asked about gender. Their subtle resistances, though, offer a way into thinking about what breaking enables in practice. Quote, dances that confirm something beyond reach, freedom possibly, but present within the capacity of the physicality of doing. So that was to France again. I named this contrasting sensibility simply in relation because B-girls hint at it at precisely those moments when researchers attempt to position them in opposition to B-boys. Originality further illuminates what in relation can mean. First, it calls for distinctiveness over sameness, which speaks to the embedded heterogeneity of the breaking and the ideal that every breaker has their own flavor. Second, ciphers capture the dynamics of coming together across differences while being brought into the folds of a shared culture. In relation is perhaps best understood as an always already active otherwise possibility. And I think of otherwise possibility in the lines of Sean Crawley, who has written about that, one that reminds us that the normative world is not the only world. I also chose in relation because it is inexact, an idea rather than a self-contained theory, and it invokes a connection to poet and philosopher Edouard Glissant's work, who has been taken up by hip-hop scholars because he offers language that captures aspects of hip-hop sociality in a global context. In his book, Poetics of Relation, Glissant delves into a distinct formulation of relationality from a Caribbean perspective that moves away from one of origins or roots, which he likens to relationship to kinship or bloodline, in favor of rhizomes, something he borrows from Deleuze and Guattari, which formulates cultural contact that produces, quote, an immeasurable intermixing of cultures. Rooted relationality, as he refers to it, gets ideologically linked to European conquest and attempts to bring everyone in the world over into its logics and control. And Glissant instead privileges what he refers to as relational identities that focus on shared and expanding knowledge, since such relations are infinite. And he writes the following, quote, relation is learning more and more to go beyond judgments into the unexpected dark of art's uprisings. Its beauty springs from the stable and the unstable, from the deviance of many particular poetics and the clairvoyance of relational poetics. The more things it standardizes into a state of lethargy, the more rebellious consciousness it arouses. Glissant formulates a multiplicity irreducible to sameness as a, quote, unity diversity, wherein difference is fundamental part of the whole rather than something to be eradicated or corrected. And as a consequence of the proliferation of connections through difference, ciphers foster horizontal relations across them by staging dance encounters with each other and those that would be othered in the same circle. Relationality thus manifests in poetics, aesthetics, whose upsurgings resist standardization, and efforts to contain or control it consequently compel its rebelliousness. Africanist aesthetics tap into hip-hop's potential for internal cultural regeneration and expansion through an interplay of tradition and difference, an aesthetic expression of a unity diversity, and a complicity with otherness, a sociality that is operative even at the scale of the body. And that takes us into when I say entering the circle with Black Pearl. And so what we're looking at is a very short clip. This is like the first run in the cipher from B-Girl Black Pearl at a pre-party to International Battle of the Year in 2006. So on a brisk night in October, Black Pearl, a B-girl from Amsterdam, brought her own unique brand of fire to a muggy dance club in Braunschweig, Germany, for a B-girl battle that night before International Battle of the Year in 2006. Watching Black Pearl felt like listening to James Brown. Her frenetic top rock embodied those classical drum breaks. The joyful chorus of a horn section was like her energy. It elevated the groove. She jumped into that sonic landscape and played there. Black Pearl reminded me of a James Brown song because she embodied a foundational sensibility emblematic of the music pumping through the speakers. And even though I stood well above this battle, my view half obstructed by the railing of the balcony and the crowd below, I could feel her force and was drawn in by it. That is precisely what made her so badass. And again, and I'll just repeat this, like, if you reduce ciphers to strictly a visual entity, you miss a lot, and you can see what the footage makes possible and doesn't, right? But the experience of it, the memory of it, the feeling of it, the energy of it, that persists and that lives in the experience of being there. Black Pearl wavered between a kind of confrontational approach, which is common in breaking, and a dismissive attitude, which is less common than the in-your-face practice. And she used her curves to accent her delivery. At moments, she would tauntingly shimmy her shoulders and breast in her opponent's face to the rhythm or dance too close, and then daring the opposing B-girl with a sinister smirk. And then with the flick of a wrist and a wave of hand, she would turn her back to the opposing crew, switching her hips and sashaying away as if she couldn't be bothered, much like the countless times I've seen other Black women do the same. Black Pearl even top rocked with her arms akimbo, a gesture expressive of Black and particularly Afro-Caribbean womanly impudence. Arms akimbo is, it's that stance, is also a Kikongo stance associated with authority, quote, proclaiming a person ready to accept the challenge of a situation, end quote. Black Pearl's style was already an expression of a certain kind of relational sensibility on a corporeal level, or rather a corporeal orature, a term from de France, that I interpreted through multiple cultural and gendered approaches to confrontation and aggression. Now, in my interview with Black Pearl, the afternoon following her battle, she both drew attention to the challenges her body presented when learning to break, and she drew attention to breaking's affirmation of her body as it is. And so I have this quote kind of split up in between 3 videos. My hope is that the sound is fine, and I will attempt to very quickly summarize what she says at the end. The total amount of the clips, I think, will be at close to 3 minutes. So yeah, so in our interview, she talks about breaking's affirmation of her body as it is. Okay, so basically she says she kind of got into it through a boyfriend, not understanding breaking initially, and then getting into it because she was already a dancer, street dancer, hip hop dancer. And in doing so, yeah, realized like she had to have a different relationship to her body in relationship to the dance, even as she recognized that the dance opened up some other kind of space for her. So while the challenges of learning to break limited her initial enthusiasm about it, breaking nonetheless offered a path to self-expression that her commercial dance background foreclosed, a path that freed her from certain industry demands. Image building type work meant conformity to music and dance industry standards of size and hair and, quote, all of those things that had bearing on her income. That's her remarks about the heaviness she felt while learning to break, to me, correlated to doing the dance, her literal capacity to bear her own weight in a form that relies heavily on upper body strength. What she found in breaking was a kind of freedom from the confines of the music and dance industries, even as she encountered new challenges. So this is not a kind of capital F freedom, since it still operates within a set of expectations and regulations that look down on normative feminine qualities, but instead the freedom to play with gendered energies under the expectation that they innovate forms of expression all her own. Further, breaking opened up understandings about who she was in the world. And she reflected on the aforementioned battle and feeling surprised about
So what got you into B-girling? When did you start?
Sorry. And feeling surprised about her own performance. And so this is again part of the same interview, and she's talking about how she felt about the battle, the tiny clip that you saw of the battle the night before. So in this part, what I'm interested in and curious about is her own confusion about how aggressive she felt she was in the battle, because she's like, I'm not really an aggressive person. And she kept repeating, I didn't know it was there. So Black Pearl is somewhat taken aback by how she performed in battle. In this case, she was confused by her overall aggressiveness and seemed more reflective of how far she deviated from her own sense of self. At the time of the interview, I thought it ironic that the qualities in her dancing that I was most drawn to were for her somewhat off-putting. Yet she was also clearly curious about what she already possessed, something already there, her language, right? So her originality was in part an improvisation through the unfamiliar territory of a self that was unpoliced and unrestrained by the expectations placed on her by commercial industries or society. Black Pearl would tell me at another point in the interview that one can see their naked truth in a cipher. In practice, though, that truth seemed to make her nervous and destabilize the certainty about who she is. In relation, in the Black Pearl example, is less about the connection to others, literally in the circle, than it is about the connection to the multiplicity of selves and the other within. That breaking ciphers bring all of those elements into conversation is key. In some ways, Black Pearl's discussion represents my interpretation of how these competing formulations of relation coexist. The binary may shape her learning, but it was not an all-encompassing force. Black Pearl's battle style, an amalgam of gestures of aggression from multiple repertoires and across various aspects of her identities, was the embodiment of a sensibility that makes room for these multiple repertoires to coexist. Breaking offered her an otherwise way of relating to her own body and to the world through dance. And perhaps, too, this tells us something about the increasing number of B-girls worldwide who also find something liberating in the culture. This can perhaps be thought of as an embodiment of rhizomatic identities. And so in this case, I'm thinking about, I'm returning to In Relation and thinking about the book, The Rhizomes of Blackness, A Critical Ethnography of Hip Hop Language, Identity, and the Politics of Becoming by linguistic anthropologist Awad Ibrahim, who elaborates on rhizomes, more specifically via Deleuze and Guattari rather than Glissant, to explore hip hop among Afro-Caribbean and African immigrant youth in Toronto. Ibrahim offers the following, quote, rhizomatic identity is a line of flight that welcomes sociality with everything that it brings, the good and the ugly. But there are no guarantees about what its final product might look like or what maze it has to go through to get there, unquote. Kita's definition is a perpetual state of becoming that branches out in varied directions, resists linear hierarchy, and does so in a way that is inclusive of the good and the ugly it brings, the liberatory and the profane, the problematic, all are all part of the cipher. Rhizomatic identities in Ibrahim's formulation is marked by uncertainty and the commingling with rather than the excision of its unsavory parts. These are preconditions for a welcoming sociality. B-girls breaking identities in the past that got them there are a material manifestation of rhizomatic identities. And if breaking challenges us to conceive of our relation to each other in expansive and rhizomatic ways, then In Relation deprioritizes hierarchies and control in favor of horizontal relations made real in practice. When we focus on B-girls and battle ciphers, those aesthetics reveal connections that, even when expressed in binaristic terms, also operate in excess of them. I call that excess in relation. Breaking was a meaningful way of living out aspects of herself and recognizing that the other is also her, because negotiating differences, internal or external, is part of the game. This leads to my second example, which also takes up a consideration of epistemologies of sociality embedded in practice and Africanist aesthetics. And that specific aesthetic is, I refer to as being on the one, thinking about it as ciphering of funk sociality. So I should be clear now, the cipher is a locus of a multitude of cultural encounters which open up the possibility of people dancing together in a ritual of restorative creativity. In so doing, ciphers create worlds unto themselves that stage interactions between tradition and change, continually bringing the individual back to modes of sociality activated by foundational aesthetic directives. While ciphering is a collective act, this does not mean that individual expression is less meaningful, especially since individual originality matters so much. Instead, it means that the individual expression is contextually meaningful, or as Gina Capone writes in the introduction to Signifying, Sanctifying, and Slam Dunking, a reader in African-American expressive culture. The virtuosic individual performance is a social act inspiring the team and the community. Unquote. This is a transgressive approach to sociality, especially vis-a-vis a Western and distinctly American glorification of the rugged individual. Here, individual virtuosity reinvigorates the collective. So as social spaces that teach practitioners how to participate in them, ciphers offer modes of sociality that route individual practitioners in all of their diversity to a collective or group to whom they are then accountable, even if just for that moment in the immediate cipher. If ciphering's Africanist aesthetics are tools that can make and unmake or remake worlds, as performance anthropologist Doreen Kondo describes of world making, then those worlds help to keep everybody involved, active, and interdependent, as Capone furthers, activating a transgressive sociality and the possibilities therein. That is because breakers do not just interpret the music, they are a physical manifestation of a social relationship to rhythm. Capone describes it as finding the rhythmic center or a place within the group of a polyrhythmic environment that centers, and that center is felt and heard, but not necessarily played. She states that finding that center requires vigilance and attention to rhythmic relationships in a polyrhythmic environment, or simply being in the same groove with a rhythm that may not be played, but to which the environment is attuned. And so she cites multiple terms offered by different ethnomusicologists of African musical genres that capture this dynamic. So one of those terms is additional rhythm. Another is a metronome sense. Another is the hidden rhythm or subjective beat. And finally, the invisible conductor keeping everybody in sync. Sensing the invisible rhythm is part of getting into a groove. And with respect to breaking ciphers, I use a concept from funk music, which seems the most fitting for breaking, being on the one. Popularized by James Brown, the phrase on the one is a hallmark of funk's funkiness. While some simply think of this as a call for the band to start playing on the one, it is more than a reference to the beat. And in his work, Funk, the music, the people, and the rhythm of the one, radio host and funk historian Ricky Vincent talks about the philosophical import of the rhythmic center. And here's an excerpt quote for you to see there. His quote is a little bit longer. He writes, "A locked, happening rhythm brings everybody together, grooving as one. Ultimately, to be on the one, the musical performance is not only emphasizing an ancient rhythmic pattern, it is emphasizing the essential openness toward all participants to the groove. Locked, yet fluid. When everything is on the one, a harmony among all people is achieved. When George Clinton is heard chanting on stage on the one, everybody on the one, he isn't trying to get his band on the beat. They're already there. He's savoring the rhythmic lock that has brought the entire house together as one." What Vincent terms an ancient rhythmic pattern echoes in Capone's discussion of a hidden rhythm, describing it as a locked happening or a locked yet fluid harmony. Vincent's phrasing draws out the freedom within the structure. When considered alongside the hidden rhythm, getting into the rhythmic center requires a full sensorium, a sensing, listening while watching and playing sensibility. Vincent also recognizes that anyone who is compelled to dance is part of the collective, noting that they add, quote, "yet another rhythmic contribution to the overall group experience," unquote. B-boys Visine and Po One explained a version of this to me one night after a battle in Los Angeles. As a group of 7 or 8 of us ate eggs at a late night diner, Po held up one index finger, referring to it as the beat, and then used his other index finger to dance around it. It was a gestural depiction of a sonic spatial plane within the music wherein he could play, move with and against, but never offbeat, dancing the hidden rhythm. Visine concurred, clarifying that it's a matter of skill, a possibility available to those who already know what they're doing. While breakers do not go around calling for folks to be on the one, they are encouraged to dance the song and find the pocket, the rhythmic center, or locked happening. Since ciphers are more than a sum of their parts, kinesthetically getting in sync is generative of more than meets the eye. Finding the rhythmic center opens up another perceptual plane. African dance scholar and choreographer Karioma Welshassante describes it as, quote, something extra that occurs or exists in a dimensional sense that she expressly ties to rhythmic sensibility. She writes, there's a plateau feeling, an area perceived as depth that arises out of African dances. The dimensional aspiration speaks to the supernatural in space, the presence beyond the visual presence. The dimensional aspect is characteristic of all the senses in that it's by definition extrasensory. It is not a measured dimension, but rather a perceived dimension. Dimensionality suggests a spatial plane and a realm beyond the visual and perceived as a depth in the ritual itself, similar to the spatiality of getting into the rhythmic center. So rather than a colloquial refrain in a particular musical genre, to be on the one is an embodied philosophy about the individual in the collective that entails a dimensional sensory experience activated through dancing that rhythmic center. I'm ultimately suggesting that there is a certain relationship between a theory about the individual within the collective and an extrasensory experience of dimensional or spatial depth, through which that theory of the connection gets embodied and experienced as real, at least in a moment. So for me, then, I look to Rockefeller, B-Girl Rockefeller again, to think about what opens up in how we experience that rhythmic happening, that locked center, that sociality, and particularly the tensions of an expansive sociality, the good and the ugly. And Rock attends to the work of being in this together. And so, okay, I have to read a lengthy quote from her that I would so much rather play for you, but I'm gonna have to read it. So for example, at one point in the interview, Rock addressed the complicated ways race matters to breaking by recounting an exchange she had with a young white B-girl and her mother. I quote at length to capture her full comments, and you'll see when this particular quote comes up in the midst of it. It is a bit long, and I apologize. So I asked her, so when you started dancing, was there a sense that, was there a lot of tension around racially, who should or shouldn't be doing whatever in hip hop? Poorly formed question, admittedly. And Rock's response, racially. See, now this is something that it's, I don't know. I don't even know sometimes if it applies when it comes to breaking, because it really is about the soul of the dance. I was having a conversation with a young white beer girl because I was telling her, you know, you being white, that's never going to go away. This being a Black dance, that's never going to go away either. You have to first become well-versed at is acknowledging the fact that slavery or oppression or European country on their colonies, you have to be able to acknowledge that that shit was wrong and that it's still wrong, so that, you know, when conversations come up, you can honestly say, yes, that was wrong. And that has nothing to do with me, because that isn't even your generation. It's not your mom's or your grandmother's generation. We're talking eons, oh my gosh, of imperialism. But you are to acknowledge, for you to acknowledge it helps me perceive you as an ally. And the fact that you renounce your privilege in the society is helpful. What is also helpful to you is to become a soulful dancer. You have to go and study this dance and be good without a doubt, and always contribute back to the people who created it, back to the people who teach you, because you have to give back to the communities and not just take away from it. And I explained that to her. Unfortunately, her mom doesn't believe that, doesn't understand that. And I don't even know how to have a conversation with her, because when she thought, when she, the daughter, lost that competition, she, the mom, was like, oh, you know, my daughter's white and that's why she didn't win. And I would one day like to address her mom and say, you're gonna have to let that go, because your daughter isn't actually that good. Yes, she can do head spins. Yes, she can do all the power moves, but dancing wise and the soul of it, it's not there. And she needs time. I needed time. I could rock house, I could rock rap dancing, you know, I could do salsa, I could do African, but this dance, when I started the first 3 or 4 years, not yet. And even my 5th and 6th years, I had the moves, but I still was trying to navigate the soulfulness of it. If that was me and I come from this and I have an African diasporic background, you've got to work. And she and her mom have to analyze that, unquote. So Rockefeller's initial hesitancy to talk about race quickly gave way to a generous response, despite my own struggle to ask the question well. While sequence and setting are omitted, Rock recounted two parallel examples of precisely the ways that race comes into conversations about style and the inevitable points of tension born out of the impossibility for movement alone to bridge the gaps between us. Though it might appear that Rock simply reiterated a power versus style critique, which is something I talked about earlier in the chapter, her reference to soulfulness moves beyond that binary. Being good is more than knowing moves. Rock's emphasis on a deeper study of the dance, or perhaps deeper study as a dimension of the dance, means understanding that history plays a part here too. At the same time, Rockefeller is not suggesting that Blackness alone is the key. For one, her critical use of Blackness is much more nuanced than the mother, who accused the judges of so-called reverse racism. The mother seems to acknowledge that race can matter, but only relative to her own perceived victimization. When Rock initially named breaking a Black dance that will always be so, she both marked it as African diasporic and as a product of world Black histories inclusive of, but not exclusive to, US African Americans. She names histories of Black people in various countries in opposition to white European and American histories of imperialism, capitalist expansion, and social and political privilege. The multiplicity of meanings of Blackness in her discussion disrupts passive assumptions of a monolithic group. Second, despite having already labeled it a Black dance, Rock herself could not simply master breaking's nuances, clarifying that her dance background in diasporic genres may have helped, but were not enough. Rockefeller's use of Black was political, ethno-racial, and culturally diasporic, all of which commingle in her ideas of a deeper study moving towards soulfulness. A deeper study speaks to being in dynamic relationship to the things that do and don't apply to dance, like race. And that theme of what does and does not apply was recurring in our interview. The things that do and do not apply yet matter may be better understood through what Cornel West describes as the, quote, cannot not know of the realities that shape Black lives, and by extension, Black expressive cultures. So West writes, quote, the concrete, everyday response to institutionalized terrorism, from slavery or Jim Crowism, was to deploy weapons of kinetic orality, passionate physicality, and combative spirituality to survive and dream of freedom. Black cultural practices emerge out of an acknowledgement of a reality that they cannot not know, the ragged edges of the real of necessity, a reality historically constructed by white supremacist practices in North America during the age of Europe. These ragged edges of not being able to eat, not to have shelter, not to have healthcare, all of this is infused into the strategies and styles of Black cultural practices, unquote. West's phrasing amplifies the unavoidable realities historically and today that inform Black expressive practices. How well they are known is probably relative, but they cannot not know is a different kind of baseline. I hear echoes of Rock's sensibility here that the things that do and don't apply reflect an awareness of unavoidable truths, capturing the ambiguity of knowledge that she cannot opt out of, even if disbelieved or ignored. Such realities matter to the dance precisely because they contextualize the socio-political conditions of breaking and hip hop, the ragged edges of an outlaw sensibility. Despite the impossibility of totally renouncing one's privilege, Rock also recognized how hip hop lent itself to working through other structures of power, including gender. And she goes on to organize, she talks about this a bit in our interview and in her on the ground work at that time and subsequent. She goes on to organize with other B-girls. She's established community conversations around gender tensions within the breaking community and even filmed a documentary that I'm spacing on the name of, but I'll try to remember by the end. So the message in all of this is that, at least in part, that the way through these struggles is with and through hip hop. So I'm thinking about my conclusion now. Breaking ciphers have something to say about our interconnected world, and ciphering's Africanist aesthetics make that apparent. The sensibilities they teach live in the body in substantive ways and attend to embodied connections across differences, often inciting desires for more overt political efforts, for hip hop to be engaged in more overt political efforts. In Close to the Edge, In Search of the Global Hip Hop Generation, sociologist Sujatha Fernandez explores the lived differences between the multiple, sometimes conflicting local hip hop scenes in different parts of the world. And she goes to Chicago, Caracas, Havana, and Sydney, asking what of that political hope actually survives the inevitable tensions of difference. And for example, she's looking at deepening national identities and differential economic and political privileges. What she finds is that, quote, creating a broader fellowship that would unite hip-hoppers across racial lines requires more than rhetoric of international alliances and cultural borrowings. It depended on the existences of spaces of mutual interaction and experiences within working class areas and diasporas where collaborations could be realized, unquote. Fernandez shifts her expectations about the nature of the political, arguing instead that while hip-hop did not propagate a singular movement, its strength was in the myriad of local forms of expression that made it possible. In her work, she highlights working class and rural-urban collaborations as well as international ones, calling forth a necessary presence of different kinds of others as part of the cipher. What practice tells us is that the everyday ways, the trained into the body ways, the sweating on each other in ciphers ways that connect people across differences actually establishes ground for horizontal exchanges that, at their heart, resonate with the type of coalitional politics that underlies Fernandez's hope. Such a politics locates its potentiality in the capacity for hip hop to make room for the local scene to see itself in there too. And I'm thinking specifically, for example, in Jackie Shalhoub's 2008 documentary, Slingshot Hip Hop. Members of the Palestinian hip hop group DAM recognize a connection to African-American socio-political struggles via a Tupac music video. They credit Pac with the visual representations of structural ghettoization for moving them past a bling-centric rap music, stating, quote, "It looked like he filmed it in our hometown lead, even though we didn't know English and we didn't get the lyrics, we made the connection," unquote. Activist and abolitionist Angela Davis's term, intersectionality of struggle, captures a similar sense of connection, but one animated by planetary struggles against racism, homophobia, and transphobia. Davis's concept activates a point of mutual understanding specifically based on socio-political positionality within intersecting structures of power. For example, she gives an example of Palestinian activists sharing information about protesting violent military armed police with activists in Ferguson, Missouri, who were protesting the police killing of Michael Brown, as an example of an intersectionality of struggles. In a way, it is a recognition of another's cannot not know of state violence in this case, that registers as a willingness to take up another person's struggle, another people's struggle, because they're connected to and have bearing on one's own. And this enables a political interconnectedness that can push us toward a more just world. And so, I wrote this part over 3 years ago, and today, in light of the genocide happening against Palestinians, this point of connection feels all the more worth stating. And if an expansive sociality, tensions and all, compels us to dig deeper into an understanding of our interconnectedness and entanglement, and in the context of my work and entanglement specifically with Blackness, then by extension, it can also remind us of an entanglement of overlapping struggles and the necessity for us to stand up for each other and all others. So stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here and sharing your knowledge, sharing your work. And I hope you have a great day, because your day is just beginning. I was just ending with a thunderstorm actually when I look out the window. So yeah.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my work with y'all and see you again. It's been so long.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you very much. And I wish you a good evening and a good night. Goodbye.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.
Bye.